All right, let's move on to a discussion of adolescents and their families. And some of the topics we'll be talking about in this chapter have to do with the changes in family structure over the last number of years, different kinds of parenting styles and the effects on adolescent, a little bit about parent-adolescent conflict, and then the effects of divorce and remarriage on teens. So in order to understand adolescents, we absolutely have to understand how they interact with their family and the impact of their family. So I'm going to start with this great quote from Mark Twain. He said, "When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much he had learned in 7 years." And isn't that the truth? You know, when you're a kid, when you're a teenager, your parents are just, they don't know anything, they don't understand anything. And a lot of that, of course, is because of the personal fable. But once you get older, how your perspective changes. I have a lot of cartoons in this chapter, and I've just kind of thrown them in at different places. That little cartoon Zitz with the teenage boy Jeremy, there's just a lot on parenting, and so just to give us a little mental break, I've scattered them around. So here's the first one. Jeremy says, "The older I get, the smarter you get, yet the older you get, the more clueless you become. Life is full of amusing little cruelties." And Dad says, "If they ever find a cure for adolescence, I'm buying stock in the company." Well, of course, I'd be interested in that now myself. "Hi, I'm the stupidest human on the planet. Pleased to meet you. I'm hopelessly out of touch." Jeremy says, "I hate parents' night." So this is kind of how it is for a lot of parents. Not every parent, but lots of them. So let's start off by looking at a historical view of how the parent-adolescent relationship has changed over the years. And I'm going to take a really broad view. I'm not going to go year by any means. And it's important to take a look at this because this sets the basis for current family patterns that we see between teens and their parents. So within the last 2 centuries, a couple things we've seen, first of all, is a declining birth rate. In the year 1800, adolescents grew up in large families. The average U.S. woman had 8 kids on average. So that means that teens grew up as pseudo-parents for many of their siblings because life was hard. The women had to work in the home. The men worked outside the home. There wasn't a lot of money. Oftentimes it was farm or laboring. And so teenagers basically had to grow up very quickly and take care of their younger siblings. We've also seen an increase in life expectancy. The average age that people lived in 1900 was 45. Now it's between 75 and 80. You know, back at the turn of the century, marriages usually ended in the young death of a spouse, so remarriage was very common, and often they remarried relatives. So I can use my own family as an example. My great-grandfather's wife died after childbirth. She was in her late 20s, early 30s, and he married her sister and then went on and had several more kids. And apparently that was pretty common at that time. So the increased life expectancy has changed. People are living longer and certainly not having as many children. We also see the increased urbanization in the last 2 centuries as a big change. Again, around 1800, 70% of kids lived in farm families and stayed there. So even though kids grew up and got married and had kids of their own, they basically stayed in the same land as their parents did. So around the turn of the century, new opportunities for education and jobs, this is around 1900, took them to the cities where they were exposed to things they weren't in their more rural communities. They were exposed to alcohol and dating, things they had not previously. And also over the last 200 years, the range of functions that the family serves has decreased. Many functions the family has served has been taken over by institutions. So look at all these functions that are important in raising a child: educating them, providing them with religious experience, taking care of their medical needs, economically supporting them, providing recreation and fun, and then nurturance. Now, only the nurturance effective functions are fulfilled by families. We send kids to school. We send them to churches or religious schools. Doctors take care of their medical needs. Economic support is still done by the parents to some extent, but kids then go on and make their own money, and they tend to spend most of their recreational time with friends from school or with friends. So the role of the family has changed substantially in the last 2 centuries. Now let's take a more recent look. In the last 50 years, some of the most substantial changes in history have occurred. So, for example, the increasing divorce rate. The United States has the highest divorce rate of any industrialized country. The statistic is that roughly half of teenagers' parents will divorce, and then 3/4 of those, who divorce will have to deal with step parents. And at the end of this lecture, we're going to talk specifically about step parents and the challenges that go with that. Okay, got these stats up here. Now, along with that comes the rise in single-parent households. So when you combine divorced and never married parents, then we do find some racial ethnic disparities. Only about 20% of African American teenagers and 45 to 50% of white American teenagers grow to the age of 18 with both parents in the home. So lots of divorce. And I realize that's not always a bad thing, but typically single parent homes, there are often more economic issues and other kinds of things which we'll talk about. And then in addition, the rise in dual earner families. Mothers started entering the workplace about 60 years ago or so. And for many of you, and if we were all together, I would do a poll if your mom worked outside of the home, if you grew up in just a typical kind of home setting. But it used to be that mothers never worked. So since they started entering the workforce 60 years ago, that has had a psychological and an economic effect on American families. So we will talk about that. Higher standards of living, higher incomes, that kind of thing. Okay, another silly cartoon here. Here's your breakfast, Jeremy. Scrambled eggs, toast, fresh squeezed orange juice, and a vitamin. I slipped a $10 bill into your wallet for lunch and any school supplies that you might need. When you get home, I'll have a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies for you. Oh, would you mail this check for your guitar lessons on the way? Why do I have to do everything around here? Very true. So true. Teenagers feel put upon, very much oftentimes the case. So funny and sad at the same time. All right, well, let's turn and take a look at how a teenager's relationship changes with their parents as they age. Now, the interesting way that they collect research on this is through a technique called the experience sampling method. What researchers will do is take adolescents who are enrolled in their study, and they used to give them beepers, but now they'll send them text messages. And at various times in the day, the teenagers will get a text message asking them questions like, where are you? What are you doing? What's your experience like? How are you feeling? And it's not meant to be intrusive. Teenagers know that this is going to happen. It's more to get an idea of what their experiences are like throughout the day. So it's a very clever way of getting here and now sampling from teenagers. Here are some things we know. First of all, there are changes in the number of interactions that teens have with their parents. These are kind of the bigger changes. So in general, it has to do with the time spent. On average, teenagers spend about an hour a day of shared activity with their parents. So 1 hour a day on average doing something with their parents. And what do you think that is? Now, typically when I ask this question, I get things like doing chores, having dinner together. Nope, it's watching TV or watching a show. It's usually TV. We know that mothers are more involved with their adolescents, for better or for worse. Teenagers report that they feel closer to their mothers than their fathers, and that's especially true for girls. They have more conversations with their mothers, but they also report it's on here. But they also report more negative feelings, more conflict with their mothers, and some positive emotions decrease. And this seems to be because in still the typical American household, the mother is the main disciplinarian in charge of the kind of the executive functioning of the household. And so teenagers have more interactions with her. And of course, a larger percentage of those are going to be problematic. If there is a home with a mother and a father, if that's the situation, fathers tend to be less involved and on average spend about 12 minutes a day, teenagers spend with their dad doing a shared activity, and that is also watching TV or some kind of screen time. Teenagers also report that they enjoy their time with their dad less than the dad does. So let's say a teenager and their dad go out to play basketball and come back in, and the dad's feeling really good about the quality time they have with their teenager, and the kid just feels like, can I get back to my room or with my friends, something like that. Teenagers oftentimes feel annoyed by chores they have to do, and annoyed when they're asked to help. And I was just thinking about an example just from my own teenage years. We had to do chores, my sister and I, when we were growing up, but we lived in the city. It's not like we had farms to work on or anything strenuous like that. And one of our chores was to empty the dishwasher. And my mom would say, okay, it's time to empty the dishwasher. And you would have thought it was the end of the world. I was so annoyed and bothered by that. Because, it took no more than 2 minutes, but every day it would just annoy me. Chores were annoying. So sad. Teenagers see chores as harassment for the most part. But despite these things, it's important to understand that parents are still the most important sources of comfort and security for teenagers. So if parents are warm and supportive, parents can help alleviate an adolescent's bad mood, problems, and if they're unavailable and unresponsive, teenagers' mood tends to get worse and they feel just not as close or connected to their parents. So even though there are the hassles and things along like that in the conflict, which we'll talk a little bit more about, there are also still those incredibly important sources. Now the cartoon here, sometimes I dread coming home. Just once I'd like to go to my room without going through an interrogation. How was your day? What did you do? Are you hungry? Who'd you see? Where'd you go? Why can't they just understand I want to be left alone? He comes in, looks around. I want to be left alone, not ignored. So this is the truth. The teenagers want something and they don't want it at the same time, very often, especially when it comes to their parents. Okay, so how do parenting styles affect teenagers? Now, this is probably a theory that you studied in child development or perhaps even in intro psych, but I want to show you how it applies to teenagers. There has been 50 years of pretty consistent research results looking at the effect of parenting styles on teenagers. When you're doing this, it's really best to survey both kids and parents, because if you ask kids how their parents are, they're probably going to give you different answers than how parents say they are. So if you get the opinions of both of them, you can do some reconciliation there. So one of the theories that I want to talk with you about is Diana Baumrind. You've probably heard of her before. There's a picture of her back in the 60s and the 70s. She said that there are two dimensions to most parenting styles. The level of demandingness, which is how much control and how much restrictiveness parents put on their kids. Do parents set rules and expect compliance? And then the level of responsiveness, which is how much warmth and love do parents give their kids. And this is also the degree to which parents are sensitive to their kids' needs and express love and concern. So I think demandingness and responsiveness are pretty self-explanatory. Now, what we can do here is combine levels of demandingness and responsiveness to come up with different parenting styles. So Baumrind and her colleagues looked at combining the demandingness and the responsiveness, and we get different kinds of parenting styles. So let me go through these a little bit. I'm going to put these slides on the unrecorded PowerPoints on Blackboard, so you'll be able to see those. And this is also in your book. Okay, so if we combine high levels of demandingness and high levels of responsiveness, we've got an authoritative parenting style if they're high on both. So these are parents who set clear rules and expectations for their kids. They explain reasons for their rules, and there is room for negotiation and compromise. So if parents have, let's say, an 11 o'clock curfew on the weekends for their teenagers, but the kid says, there's a special party or get together or dance or whatnot, can I please stay out until midnight? Parents will consider that. Other types of parenting will say no, 11 o'clock is the rule. So if there's a good explanation and if the teenager has invoked trust from the parent, they would consider that. So parents have expectations. They're pretty firm on the expectations, but there's some give and take, and they are loving and responsive at the same time. Now, what about if we combine high levels of demandingness and low levels of responsiveness? We get an authoritarian parenting style that's different than authoritative. So authoritarian parents have strict rules and they require strict obedience, usually without compromise. There isn't room for explanation or discussion, and there is low warmth and not much emotional attachment. So these are kind of the dictator parents. You do what I say because I said so. Over here, low levels of demandingness and high levels of responsiveness are the indulgent parents, and sometimes you'll see this listed as permissive. These are parents who have very few clear expectations and rarely discipline their kids. They use a lot of unconditional love, but their discipline and feeling like discipline and control will squelch their kids, and so they're very indulgent. Kids are given lots of love and lots of freedom, and perhaps a little bit too much. We'll talk about consequences here in a moment. And then finally, we've got the parents who are low in demandingness and low in responsiveness, and these are what we call the indifferent parents. They seem uninvolved and not very interested. They don't ask much of their kids, and they don't show much warmth and love toward their kids. So all of these, except authoritarian, seem like they would promote autonomy in their kids because kids are given freedom. So let's look at the reality of that. As far as the effects of these discipline practices on teenagers, here are some things that we see. The authoritative parents tend to produce kids in general that are independent, self-assured, socially skilled, they're creative. So the authoritative parenting has the most positive effects on teens. The authoritarian parent, these produce kids that are more dependent, conforming, because these are parents that are essentially telling their kids what to do all the time, and kids aren't allowed to make decisions or mistakes for themselves. The indulgent parent tends to raise kids that are more irresponsible and conforming and immature. Kids need direction, and if they don't get direction from their parents, they're going to find it from some other place, and so they may follow other kids around. And then finally, the indifferent parent, these are kids that tend to have the most problems. They are impulsive, may behave in some delinquent behaviors, become involved in early abuse of sexuality or drugs. So the authoritative parenting seems to be attached to the most healthy outcomes. These are parents that allow for a balance between allowing their kids enough autonomy to develop independence while also requiring some responsibility from them. What really becomes a problem is inconsistency between parents. So, for example, if one parent is authoritative and the other parent is indulgent, that leads to more negative outcomes, lower self-esteem, and school performance on the part of kids. So when we ask the question, what are American parents like? Let's ask kids, how do you rank your parent in terms of these four categories? We see some pretty interesting things. So a survey of diverse adolescents found the following. 37% of the adolescents ranked their parents as indifferent, authoritative 32%, authoritarian 15%, and indulgent 15%. So of all of these, the highest number, kids think their parents are indifferent, which is really pretty shocking. And the explanation for that, there's skepticism as to whether that's really true. Lots of times kids will misinterpret their parents' actions as being one way when it's really the other. But the point being, an awful lot of kids see their parents as indifferent. Authoritative parenting tends to be more common in middle than lower economic status families. So this is just important information to think about. And fortunately, we've got a lower percentage of indulgent and authoritarian, but it'd be good to see that authoritative be a little bit higher. Okay, we're going to continue this, but another cartoon here first. Oh, Jeremy, look, a box of your old picture books. Here's Goodnight Moon, Curious George, Brown Bear, Harold and the Purple Crayon. Do you remember this one? Harold uses his crayon to draw his own adventures, like drawing the boat and feeding the very hungry moose and the deserving porcupine. Yeah, and there's the dragon that guards the apple tree and finding the moon. And he says, start from the beginning. So in all, teenagers are still a little kid. Now, when we talk about parenting effects, I've kind of probably made you think that parenting causes kids. So authoritative parenting leads to an X type of kid, or authoritarian parenting leads to a Y type of kid, but it's actually much more complex than that. So let's talk about this. Parenting effects is reciprocal. It is too simplistic to say parenting style A produces teenage type B. So adolescents are affected by their parents, but they also affect their parents. That's what we call these reciprocal or bidirectional parenting. As an example, an aggressive teenager is going to probably evoke authoritarian parenting from their parents. So a teen is aggressive is going to bring out more the dictatorial, harder parent. But a retiring teenager tends to evoke indulgent parenting. So sometimes, even from the same parent, we can see different behaviors depending on the kid. So these could be siblings, and they could evoke very different parenting from their parents and see their parents as being very different. So siblings may have very different experiences. There's really 2 points I want to make here, and let me start with this one. The aggressive teen evokes the authoritarian parenting. So kids who are aggressive bring that out from their parents. But the parents' authoritarian parenting may also bring out more aggression from their teen. I didn't clarify that very well. And then this is really a separate topic here, that siblings can have very different experiences with the same parent. Okay, I told you a lot of cartoons. Oh, I guess I skipped this one. Thought I had a cartoon here. Okay, let's talk a little bit about parent-adolescent conflict and what's going on there. The way we think about conflict with parents is, when you think about G. Stanley Hall's The Storm and the Stress, it's this tumultuous time of life, lots of conflict with parents, and adolescence can be a difficult time for relationships with parents because parents may see their child changing from this compliant child to someone who is non-compliant and oppositional and resisting. And even though it certainly doesn't happen overnight, it can seem that way. And many parents deal with their adolescents as if they expect him or them to become a mature being in the next 10 to 15 minutes or so. Teenagers are going to take a long time to learn that self-control before their frontal cortex develops enough to really give them more sense and really better control. So parents who recognize that adolescents are going to take a while usually deal more calmly and competently with their problems. So parent-adolescent conflict is oftentimes seen as always a bad thing, but it's not. It has an important developmental function. It does increase in early adolescence, but it does not reach the tumultuous proportions that G. Stanley Hall imagined it would be. Very rarely does it cause lasting, huge problems between parents and kids. And some parents see all conflict as bad, but it's certainly not. Moderate conflict not only is inevitable, but may serve a positive developmental function. So let's talk about the types of conflict that teenagers typically have with their parents. So usually it's over everyday kind of stuff. Keeping their room clean, styles of dress, maintaining curfew, being on their phone too much or with their friends. It's things that do not seriously threaten the attachment between parents and their kids. And recent studies have found arguments that parents and their teens have approximately one argument every 3 days that lasts about 11 minutes. I don't know how they come up with that exacting, but that seems to be what the research shows. But these conflicts generally don't interfere with the teen's attachment to their parent. And fortunately, only about 20% of families experience prolonged, really intense arguments that are associated with runaways and delinquency and dropout and teen pregnancy and substance abuse. So those are the kind of families that really we are the most concerned about. So the conflict between teenagers and their parents peaks in early to mid-adolescence, and then it starts to decrease. It starts to go down. And that conflict is especially intense for mothers and daughters. But it's also important to note that adolescents and their parents usually agree on many important things in life, and most adolescents will report that they like and they trust their parents. Okay. So the one last thing I wanted to mention here is that many times the things that teenagers and their parents argue about appear to be trivial things. But the trivial things may mask serious ones. So for example, if a parent says, I don't like that friend that you're hanging out with, that actually could mean that we're afraid that they're going to lead you into problems, going to lead you into drugs, something like that. Or if parents say, I want you to put on a longer skirt, they may be worried not so much about the clothing, but worried someone will get the wrong idea and take advantage. So oftentimes parents may express their concerns indirectly through less serious type of concerns. Okay, what kind of conflict? What are the sources of conflict for teenagers, between teenagers and their parents here? Why does it increase in adolescence? And then in late adolescence, the conflicts start to become less frequent. One of the big sources of conflict comes from teenagers increasing cognitive capacities for, the word's escaping me, for formal thought, and their increased role of autonomy. So increasing cognitive capacities for abstract thought now make it more difficult for parents to prevail in arguments, because if a teenager wants something and the parent says no, and the teenager says, well, why not? And the parent says, because I say so, the kid can argue back, and they can come up with plausible arguments to give back to the parent. Well, you're going to know where I am, you're going to know who I'll be with, so give me a reason why the answer is still no. And also the role of autonomy. There are differences in how adolescents and parents understand and define the range of an adolescent's autonomy. So particularly in early adolescence, they tend to disagree about who should have authority over issues like dress, hairstyles, room condition, friends. One of the most common arguments is when parents say, your room is a mess, clean it up. And teenagers say, what do you care? It's my room. You never go in there. So parents see these things as issues that they should be able to set boundaries for, while teenagers see them as matters of personal choice they should be able to decide by now. So it makes perfect sense that with the combination of the cognitive capabilities and changing ideas of the role of autonomy, that would lead to more problems between teenagers and their parents. Okay, another cartoon here before we go on. Just walk past the two beached kayaks, turn right at the shelfless library, then up the trail of forgotten laundry, and you'll see the forbidden cave of squalor, first door on your right. So Sarah, his girlfriend, goes up. Your dad is so funny. And he says, that's a word for it. So just another issue between teens and their parents. The last topic that we're going to address in this chapter has to do with, unfortunately, one that is affected or affects many teenagers, the effects of divorce and remarriage. So let's take a look at that one. Since the divorce rate it's been pretty steady. It's dropped a little bit, but it remains high. Scholars have spent a lot of time investigating the effects of divorce on kids and adolescents. And there's a pretty consistent finding that kids of divorced parents are at higher risk for a variety of negative outcomes. Now, please note that I say higher risk. It's absolutely not absolute. So some of the things for teenagers that they're at higher risk for are behavior problems. So things like drug and alcohol use and abuse, early sexual behavior, psychological distress, depression, kids are withdrawn, feel anxious, and this is especially true if they are caught in a loyalty conflict. So if they're torn between their two parents and perhaps the parents are fighting for the kid to be more loyal to them, that leads to the most problems. And then academic achievement is in there also. So we know kids of parents who are divorced tend not to do as well, have lower college attendance. So those are just some general risk factors. But there is lots and lots of variability that exists with how adolescents respond to a divorce. So if we were together, I would have two questions for us to talk about. From the point of view of a teen whose parents are divorcing, what are some do's and don'ts for parents getting a divorce? And then some experts believe that parents should stay together and avoid divorce for the kids' sake. What are the pros and cons of this view? So oftentimes in the past when we've had this discussion for the first one, people will say, and there's always people in the class with experience, things like don't use the kid as a go-between and try and be civil for the kid's sake. Don't fight in front of the kids, don't lie. Those are some examples that I've seen for that first question. And for the second one, I've heard a wide variety of answers over the years. One of the most unusual ones came from a student who was telling me that her friend's parents got divorced, but then continued living together in the same house just so the kids would have both parents in the house. That's an interesting idea. I imagine there's some benefits and some potential problems with that. But as we're going to see, if people decide to stay together for the kids' sake but are not getting along, there are far more problems with that than not. So we'll get to that. Now, to say that a teenager's parents are divorced, that tells us about their family structure. The family structure is the outward characteristics of the family. So in other words, are the parents married? Are they divorced? Is anybody remarried? Is it a single, never married structure? So the family structure is the external, what everybody can see. But family structure impacts teen behavior less than family process. So family process has to do with the quality of family members' relationships with each other. So what's the level of warmth and hostility between family members, whether the family is intact or not? So the effects of divorce aren't simply divorce negatively affects kids, but divorce influences family process in ways that influence adolescent development. That's really what we're looking at and asking about. So it's the family process that's the most critical thing, not the family structure. So let's take a look here at some of the things that influence family process. And the first one we'll start with is the most important one. So if you're taking notes, you can put a star by that. So exposure to conflict between parents. Marriages rarely end without some conflicts and arguments and sometimes temper explosions. So exposure to parental conflict both before and after a divorce is painful, stressful, and damaging to adolescence. We know that. So conflict is harmful. Conflict is the most critical. But there is also some interesting research that looks at low conflict divorce. So kids of parents with low conflict divorce, meaning the parents don't really fight, there doesn't seem to be obvious disagreements, maybe there doesn't obviously seem to be anything wrong, they tend to have problems in their own relationships when they get older. They are more likely to bail out quickly of their own relationship because kids oftentimes will have no sense of why their parents parted and maybe why they didn't try harder. So the idea is that kids sometimes get the notion that it's okay to just leave a relationship that just isn't maybe the best or isn't making you happy every single day, which is impossible with any relationship. So the experts agree that it's important that when parents get divorced, that kids be told in an age-appropriate way, what the reason for it is, so kids do understand that there is a reasoning behind it. I also want to mention that even in families that are not divorced, where the parents aren't divorced, the conflict is the damaging thing to adolescent development. There is far more damage to teenagers in intact, meaning not divorced, high conflict homes than divorced, low conflict homes. So it's much better for kids and teenagers to be in households with parents who are divorced, but there isn't the conflict. The conflict just isn't there. And in fact, adolescent problems after a divorce usually begin long before the divorce because marriages rarely, as I mentioned, marriages rarely end without conflict. And so it's the exposure to the parents' conflicts rather than the specific event of a divorce that is so damaging. Okay, what about parenting practices after divorce? Here's some things to talk about. Divorce affects parenting practices. Even if it's mutually agreed upon by both parties, it's still stressful and painful for adults, and it taxes people's parenting abilities. It tends to be especially hard on mothers. Mothers usually have primary physical custody of the kids, and they are more likely to take a drop in income after a divorce. So after divorce, we see mothers oftentimes becoming less affectionate with their kids, more permissive, less consistent in their parenting because they are wrapped up in their own emotions and trying to deal with the pain themselves. So what happens is that adolescents in divorce families often have greater freedoms, which they like, but it may be more than they can handle wisely. And we also see parents may rely on adolescents as a confidant. Now, that's really a mixed blessing, because when parents rely on their teens as a confidant, they feel closer to their parents, but it's also difficult to hear, and it's inappropriate for parents to talk to their kids about their marital problems. So parents are really encouraged to find strong social support, or maybe a therapist or a counselor to deal with that, rather than their kid as a confidant. We also see inconsistent parenting. We see that perhaps one of the parents tends to be more indulgent and the other one is more strict. And with a teenager, oftentimes they're given a choice, who they want to live with or who they want to spend the night with that particular day. And they're more likely to go with the more lenient parent, which puts the other parent in a hard position. So I've already mentioned that using teen as a confidant is a problem, and using them as a go-between. Parents should not tell their teens, tell your mother this, tell your father that, etc. They should work on developing a civil relationship so that they can do that themselves. Easier said than done, I know. Okay, how about a teenager's relationship with their fathers after a divorce? Unfortunately, after a divorce, contact with fathers oftentimes declines. Oftentimes, adolescents will blame and resent their father more, because remember, they're most likely getting more of their mother's perspective on things. And so adolescents blame and resent their father more. They're more likely to sympathize with their mothers. So there's more negative feelings and fewer positive feelings toward the father after a divorce. A good mediator or a family counselor can help remedy that. Okay, so what are some ameliorating factors in a divorce? Ameliorating means what would make it better? What kinds of things would help? There's a few things. First of all, maintaining an especially good relationship with the mother is important. And I say that again, assuming that the mother is the primary physical custodian. That may not be the case. Ideally, you want to have a good relationship with both parents. Maintaining a civil relationship between the parents is absolutely critical. Remember, it's that conflict piece that causes the most problems. So again, a counselor or a mediator may be helpful. And then consistency in parenting. And consistency in parenting between households. This takes an incredible amount of maturity and forethought and compassion on the part of the parents. But in order for the kids and the teenagers to be the least impacted, it's absolutely critical. So as a final topic, how about the concept of remarriage? Oops, I'm going a little bit too far here. Now, with remarriage, many people would think that remarriage on the part of the parent would have a positive impact. The parent's going to be happier. There is perhaps greater financial security, more stability. But unfortunately, teen problems oftentimes increase with a parent's remarriage. Now, most kids, when they grow up with a step-parent, will more than likely have to deal with a stepfather. Mothers are more likely to remarry after divorce than fathers will. So the problems typically occur with the mother's remarriage. That's a more usual situation. So adolescents will oftentimes take a turn for the worse after remarriage in this way. They're more likely to report increased feelings of depression, anxiety, conduct disorders, and then more problems with academic achievement. So essentially what happens is that kids get used to a divorce, and then the parents' remarriage just throws all of the adjustment kind of back into the wheel again. So there's an interesting dynamic that shows the difference between kids and teenagers. So following a divorce, kids have a harder time than teenagers. Teenagers adjust better because they're usually in a better position to understand the reason for the divorce and perhaps see it as a better thing. But after remarriage, the opposite is true. Adolescents do worse than kids. Because if you think about it, kids who are young, it's easier for kids to attach to new people. For teenagers, that's not necessarily the case. Let's just talk about some of the reasons why adolescents have a harder time after remarriage. Here's a couple of reasons. One, this is another disruption to the family system. Again, you get used to the divorce situation, separate homes and things, and then this changes everything really in an even bigger way, and especially if there's the addition of other kids to the household. There is the issue of pseudo-authority. I hear it all the time in my counseling practice with blended families that if let's say the mom has kids, the stepdad comes in, and the stepdad feels as though he may have authority over the kids. The kids don't feel that way and get very resentful. So I've just seen argument after argument in blended families about, does the step parent have authority over the other person's kids? And it's a big issue that needs to be worked out. Ideally before the remarriage takes place, because sometimes people will get remarried thinking, oh, it'll be great, it'll be like the Brady Bunch and the kids will have new siblings. But really extensive counseling is a great thing to go into before you do this. You need your eyes wide open. Second marriages fail more often than first marriages. There's a higher percentage, something like 2/3 of second marriages fail, and it's usually because of step parenting and step kid issues. We also know that attachment is more difficult for teens. Teens are more independent, and so they're less likely to see the step parent as a parent authority. And then, of course, there's the issue with divided loyalties between the biological and the step parent. So what if you have a situation that sounds really good? What if the kids like the step parent, but then the biological parent, who has not remarried, feels like the kid's being disloyal or makes the kid feel bad, or the teenager feels bad? It can just really cause some issues, some emotional issues for the kid. The silly cartoon, I have more stepdads than you do. So the bottom line is that, divorce happens. We know it happens. Kids can adjust. Teenagers can adjust. The special time that you have to be very careful is with remarriage. That takes a lot of planning and thought and real maturity to make sure that that's done and the kids are okay. So let me leave you with one final ridiculous cartoon about teens and their parents. You can't begin to imagine how embarrassing it is to be seen with you. So this is sort of one of the rituals of adolescence. Their parents embarrass them, but they embarrass us as well. All right, that's it. I will see you next time.